Now we bring you a discussion on 10th ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting, Dialogue and Diplomacy for Global Peace and Stability. The participants are Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, Defence Expert, and Ajay Banerjee, Senior Journalist.
Good evening. Commodore Bhaskar, the Defence Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, is addressing what is called the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus in Indonesia. Besides the 10 members of the ASEAN countries, there are also invitees to this meeting, which includes India, US, China, New Zealand, and few more countries. Sir, the Minister is very categorically saying, firstly, I quote him, stand for commitment to freedom of navigation, overflight, unimpeded lawful commerce in the international waters in accordance with international laws, including the United Nations Convention on the Law at Sea or UNCLOS. Sir, though he has not named China, is this a clear reference to China?
My short answer would be yes, Ajay. If you look at the pattern or the manner in which our Defence Minister Shri Rajnath Singh has been commenting and giving his own assessment of the Indo-Pacific as a region and the need for respecting international law, customary norms, this has been what I would call as a consistent theme, both by Prime Minister Modi and by the Defence Minister Mr. Rajnath Singh. And the fact that he has made the same observation in Jakarta, where he is engaging with the ASEAN defence ministers and other partners of ASEAN, has a certain political symbolism. Now, there is a contrast here, which is that all the participants at that meeting, including the United States, are concerned about China's assertiveness in the maritime domain. And the country that has been at the receiving end most recently is Philippines. Now, this is something that the entire region is aware of, and there is a lot of concern. And the fact that India has also lent its voice to express this concern, I think carries a certain relevance. And how the ministers wish to take this forward, of course, may perhaps be discussed behind closed doors. But I think Indian consistency regarding commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific remains on the table.
Commodore, the Minister went on to say a few more important things. He talked about a result-oriented cooperation with the ADMM+. He also said, I quote, conflicts extract a terrible toll in terms of human lives lost and livelihoods destroyed, disturb the stability at the regional level as well as the global level, and have adverse implications for food security, energy security, etc. Unquote. Sir, are these words hinting at unimpeded commerce through the South China Sea? Because he has not named South China Sea, nor has he named China. But the implication is very explicit in this, sir. Is it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the subtext is very clear that when we talk about unimpeded commerce, free and open navigation, the signal is towards China, but there is also what I would call as a certain protocol that is being followed by India, wherein China is not being named explicitly in these collective platforms. Because surely Delhi would have noted that the ASEAN ministers themselves, when they issued their statement on Wednesday, that is the day before there is the ASEAN Plus meeting, they preferred not to identify and call out China as it were. There was only a reference to the Code of Conduct, and that all parties to the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea are being encouraged to expedite the process. But the reality check is that this has been on the table for 20 years. That there would be a consensual code of conduct and that China would also agree. But clearly China is following its own path. And the signal from China to ASEAN is, as I've said in the past, that it is either the Chinese way or the highway. And ASEAN countries are all exceedingly cautious. They do not want to antagonize China. And therefore, my reading is that the fact that Mr. Rajnath Singh has chosen not to explicitly refer to China by name, but yet point to the principle that is at stake is significant. And I think this is where the manner in which the other partner countries such as the United States and Japan, how they would frame their remarks in relation to the principle of free and open navigation, Indo-Pacific, and China's own behavior would give us a sense about how each country is shaping its China policy.
Commodore, the Minister has also spoken very eloquently about the role of the centrality of the ASEAN countries, the 10-member ASEAN bloc. And the Minister wants that this ASEAN bloc should be central in promoting dialogue and consensus in the region. As you already mentioned about the Code of Conduct being discussed with 5 other countries. Sir, ASEAN centrality, some of them are wishy-washy with regards to China. The Minister has referred to the commitment and the need for ASEAN to work towards this regard. How powerful or how vocal can ASEAN be in this, sir?
Well, I would say that if you look at ASEAN, perhaps it's necessary to disaggregate them and look at those countries that are perhaps more sympathetic, empathetic, or dependent on China, and those which have a stake in the dispute. Now, specific to the South China Sea, we are aware that Philippines had taken China for arbitration to the International Court. This happened in 2016. And that particular award went in Philippines' favor, but China rejected it and decided that they would not be bound by the UNCLOS, the UN law on the seas, or for that matter, any kind of arbitration. And their comment immediately after the award was announced was very disparaging. It was very high-handed, and they sort of literally ticked off the International Court for even looking at this issue. That was a very strong signal in 2016, and ever since you could see that each ASEAN country has been very careful not to, as they say, step on China's toes. But concurrently, there is a lot of anxiety, and each country has differently conveyed or expressed this concern. If you look at the response within Philippines, where when there was a change in the political leadership and Mr. Marcos Jr. took over as the president from Mr. Duterte, you could see a change in Philippines' policy towards China. How effective it will be is really at this point a question mark, because over the last 2 months, there has been a lot of what you might call as very, very visible Chinese assertiveness in two areas, in the Scarborough Shoal and the way in which they have pushed out Philippines Coast Guard vessels has caused a lot of concern in Manila and in some of the other countries that are affected. Philippines protested. The foreign ministry made a very strong statement against China. But again, China, of course, had its own version, and they are putting the blame on Philippines. Along with Philippines, Indonesia and Vietnam have also experienced this kind of maritime assertiveness and bullying by China, but they have not been as vocal. So I think the ASEAN countries are sending out very clear diplomatic signals. Concurrently, they are also trying to enhance their modest military capability, and this is manifest in some of their acquisitions and some of the exercises that they are doing. For instance, the ASEAN nations are now engaging in exercises with the United States, with Japan, with South Korea. And to my mind, these could be interpreted as an attempt by the ASEAN countries to convey to China, but clearly nobody wants a shooting war. And this is where countries like India, the United States, Japan, Australia, the Quad nations also come into play. And this is a very, I would say, nuanced kind of signaling that is going on. And whether it would actually lead to a higher degree of contestation is, I think, the big question mark. And that in turn, to my mind, will depend on how the United States and China arrive at a certain modus vivendi about their own bilateral relationship. And one has been given to understand that President Biden would be raising this issue with his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Xi Jinping, in the San Francisco meeting, whose outcome we should know very soon. So I think India is looking at this in a very calibrated way and waiting for ASEAN, who are the principal interlocutors in the South China Sea, to make up their mind how they want to deal with China's not so creeping maritime assertiveness in the entire South China Sea.
Just for the benefit of our listeners, when the Commodore refers to the disputes with Philippines and China, he's talking about the South China Sea, where China has been hegemonistic. Commodore, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh also met his US counterpart, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, in Jakarta today on the sidelines of the ADMM Plus meeting. What we get to know that the Secretary of Defense US walked across the room to meet Mr. Rajnath Singh, and the two had a little side talk about the progress of the Indo-US defense relationship. The two had just met 6 days ago in New Delhi on the sidelines of the 2+2 dialogue, but still they spoke about ASEAN. What we get to learn that the two discussed the way how India and US can help ASEAN become important in the Indo-Pacific. Commodore, what are your comments on that?
Well, I would say this is a continuation of the dialogue that Mr. Rajnath Singh had with General Lloyd Austin when they met recently in Delhi, as you rightly pointed out. There, if you recall, in their opening remarks, both Mr. Rajnath Singh and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin had dwelt on the Indo-Pacific, and in a what I would call as a significant statement, Mr. Rajnath Singh had actually spoken about China.
Yes, he had.
So that was, I thought, significant. So I think, in a way, the fact that Mr. Austin had met Mr. Rajnath Singh in the manner that he did in Jakarta is an indication, perhaps, of the comfort level that now exists between the two defense ministers of India and the United States, which by itself is quite remarkable in terms of the nature of the bilateral relationship between India and the United States. And I think sending a signal to the ASEAN countries also that there is a fair amount of trust and cooperation between India and the United States. And the US has a similar relationship with Japan and Australia. And that these four countries are now working together without, again, explicitly referring to China. But I think China would be looking at these signals in the fact that there is a fair amount of joint exercises going on between the Quad nations and the ASEAN countries. But let me add in the same breath, Ajay, that there is also parallel kind of activity in the naval domain between countries like China, Russia, Pakistan, and those countries which are ostensibly not favorably oriented towards the United States. So what you're seeing is what I would call as a certain higher level, an uptick in naval activity, and related to that is naval acquisition. So I think India and the United States are differently trying to signal to ASEAN that they would be able to provide a certain degree of material support. And same is the case with Japan, which over the last 2 weeks, you saw the Japanese Prime Minister visiting Philippines and announcing that they would be providing as many as 12 boats, patrol vessels to the Philippines Coast Guard. And this itself is a signal. And India in its own way is also trying to provide bilateral support to the ASEAN countries, whether it is Vietnam or whether it is Philippines, and also engage in a fair amount of HADR or humanitarian assistance, disaster relief activity. So I think these again are what I would call as signals to ASEAN that countries that have the wherewithal are willing to provide a certain amount of support. Whether or not this will register on China, I think is, as I said, the question mark on a number of issues. And ASEAN's only, I would say, response at this point is to increase its own capacity in an individual sense and also see whether or not they can form certain partnerships that would be politically acceptable both to ASEAN and the interlocutor country, whether it is a Japan or a South Korea or an India or the United States. But it all comes back to the same central point, if I may, which is that all countries, including India, including the United States, Japan and China, by the way, are dealing with this economic and trade dependency. And how do you harmonize that with the security and strategic discord or disagreement? And I don't think any clear answer has been found. And as I said, we are not alone. China also cannot afford to rock the boat beyond a point because of its own internal challenges, the economic blowback that is happening in China now, the recession, and President Xi Jinping's own domestic political problems where he has lost his defense minister and foreign minister for reasons that still remain opaque. When I say lost, I mean that they are no longer in the cabinet for a variety of reasons. So I think this is a very complex kind of picture, but both India and the US want to recognize and acknowledge the centrality of ASEAN as they are dealing with complex challenges in the region.
Commodore, very briefly for the benefit of our listeners, the South China Sea dispute, you refer to it. We often refer to the Indo-Pacific. Sir, how is India impacted by this South China Sea dynamic? South China Sea connects Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. That is for our listeners. But Commodore, how does it impact us strategically? Very briefly.
But strategically, it impacts us in terms of upholding a certain principle. Now, there is a parallel between China's action in Galwan, which is assertiveness on contested territorial issues. The same is now visible in the South China Sea. So I think for India also, at some point we would have to take a decision about how do you resist China's creeping territoriality by using military means, either overtly or covertly. I think that is my reading of India's stake in the South China Sea.
Commodore Bhaskar, that was very enlightening for our listeners, that how you have explained the dispute in the South China Sea, how the Defence Minister Rajnath Singh has today addressed the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting Plus, which has the 10 ASEAN countries and also a few other invitees like US, China and India. Thank you for speaking to us, Commodore Bhaskar.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on 10th ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting, Dialogue and Diplomacy for Global Peace and Stability. The participants were Commodore C. Uday Bhaskar, Defence Expert, and Ajay Banerjee, Senior Journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 928 909 4044.